Okay, welcome everyone. I'm Jonathan Zeitlin. I'm the academic director of the Amsterdam Center for European Studies. This is the second of our 6 panels on differentiated integration in the European Union, promises, pitfalls, and pathways. Welcome particularly to people who were here this morning for the first panel on theory and evidence, the state of the art. I do apologize for the connectivity problems that I had then, and hopefully they won't be recurring now. This panel is on politics and preferences for and against differentiation in the EU. This is one of the areas where a lot of new research is being done by the different projects, Horizon 2020 projects linked in the DICE network. There's a lot of new public opinion research, but also research on the positions of different governments and on debates in the member states. And this is what you'll be hearing about today. Let me first introduce the panelists and then say a word about the format, and then we can plunge right in. So our first speaker is Catherine de Vries. She's professor of political science at Bocconi University in Milan. She was previously a professor at the Vrije Universiteit de VU in Amsterdam, where some of the research is still located, and she is leading a work package within the INDIV EU project on this theme. Our second speaker, Dirk Luyven, is a professor of political science and international politics at the University of Constance, and he is leading a work package in one of the other Horizon 2020 projects, EU Differentiation, Dominance and Democracy, or EU 3D. And our third set of speakers, I should say, are both also from the INDIV project. So Stefan Terle is a research associate at the Schumann Center for Advanced Studies at the European University Institute. He will be presenting research done jointly with Brigitte Lafont, who is the director of the Schumann Center, as well as a number of other centers and programs at EUI, and along with Frank Schimmelpfennig, who you heard this morning, or some of you heard this morning. She is the co-scientific coordinator of the INDIV EU project. So the speakers will present in the order that I've introduced them. I'll give them each 15 minutes or so. Then maybe I will pose a few questions, but in any case, I'll give them a chance to react to one another, and then we will open up to Q&A with you, the audience. And what I ask you, the audience, to do is to write your questions in the Q&A window, and I will then monitor them and steer them to the appropriate panelists. So without any further ado, Catherine, I turn it over to you to share your screen and present your research. But Catherine, you have to unmute.
Sorry. Thanks so much, Jonathan, for the introduction. So indeed, this is a joint work with Lisanne de Blok, who is a postdoc on the INDIV EU project and work package on public opinion and political parties and governments, and who is based at the VU, but who unfortunately couldn't be here today. So I'll give the presentation. So what we're trying to do, basically, this was a first working paper that we delivered within the project, is to try to get a sense of the existing public opinion data and some more recent data, as well as party data on differentiated integration, after which we're going to develop our own data, actually with Dirk Leuven, because the two projects are doing very similar things, in order to try to get, even a better handle on this. So if there are ways in which you think we could measure this better, we probably all agree on that. We are dealing with existing measures, but we just would like to give you an overview of how we can think about public preferences towards differentiated integration. So the context is basically that differentiated integration has increased substantively within the EU. So both what we call, which Frank Schimmelpfennig and Dirk and Bertolt Rittberger refer to as horizontal differentiated integration, which has to do with things like, for example, multi-speeds of integration and certain opt-outs, and as well as vertical DIs. So that's vertical differentiated integration. There's heterogeneity between policy areas, where we can think that monetary policy has seen much more united forces, where fiscal, in fiscal aspects we're seeing much less harmonization of policy. So we can think that across different policy areas. So this has increased, and it is also often posed as a solution to accommodate heterogeneity between member states. And this heterogeneity became, of course, vividly clear again in the recovery negotiations, where you saw some frugal northern member states pitted against the south and some other member states perhaps in between. But actually, this hinges on the idea that even if we see these aggregates at member states, that also people within these member states have these different, have these similar perceptions. And I think what we'll try to convince you of in this paper is that actually there's quite a lot of heterogeneity within member states about how one thinks about DI, and a specific difference between those who are more pro-EU, those who are more anti-EU, and also those that differ even on left-right ideology when it comes to that. So basically, kind of a bottom line of this paper is that, it might actually help to differentiate, to deal with some Eurosceptic concerns. We might get problems on the more pro-EU side, which doesn't want to see the similar type of integration. And we'll come back to the differentiation between horizontal and vertical in a minute about that. And then it's now a bit of an afterthought. So if there's other ways of how to integrate this more, we also wanted to look at the extent to which political parties are also picking up these DI preferences among voters. So I'm going to use the abbreviation DI. I mean with that differentiated integration. It's just a mouthful. So the aims are really to map public preferences for DI, to investigate determinants in those preferences, to look at socioeconomic backgrounds of people, look at differences in their overall EU preferences, examine then really the drivers, differences between Eurosceptic and more pro-EU parts of the population within member states, and then actually take out a little bit these member state effects, right? We take them out with fixed effects, and really try to understand, if we see differences based on people's positions towards the EU, but also their positions on ideology. And then the last thing, try to see if kind of political parties are also mirroring these differences. So I think the significance of this is that, as I already mentioned, these outcomes in the EU have been very diverse, and also what people want from the EU is kind of differed in certain member states. And as we said, we saw that in the Recovery Fund. So therefore, trying to understand if DI would be a solution to this politicization or to these differences in opinions that we see would be really important. And, in order to kind of deal with these radically different views on integration, the EU is actually much more dependent on public support for its project than before, because, we see that elections matter, that political parties are really aware of what the public thinks about integration. So this is a really kind of an important point where politicization is quite high, at least by the way we have measured this, people like Hans-Peter Kriesi and so on. And that also maybe the demands on the EU are quite high, but then we need to know if differentiation is really a solution to this politicization or not. And actually, the bottom line of this paper is just complicated. Maybe that's maybe that's the slogan for EU studies overall. I don't know. So what we'll do here is just, because it's more of a mapping exercise, is I'll give you an overview of the data, of some of the measures, and then just give you some results, and then I'll wrap up. So we use existing Eurobarometer data. You'll see also some of that data back in what Dirk will present. And that's just that we have different sets of Eurobarometers that ask different things. So that ask sometimes about opt-outs and multi-speed Europes, and that ask sometimes about how much you want a certain policy area to be dealt with at the EU level or not. So how far away you want harmonization or differentiation based on policy areas. Then also Bridget Lafan and her colleagues at the UI have conducted a survey in 2020, so earlier this year, where they also have where we have the unique ability that we have both kind of indicators for horizontal DI, so that's different policy areas wanting to see different levels of harmonization or differentiation, as well as vertical DI when it comes to differences across member states. So we can actually plot those things next to each other and really see how that works. And then the third data source is Chapel Hill Expert Survey, where we have positions of political parties. So as I said, DI preferences, how are we going to measure them? So we have multi-speeds, opt-outs. Oh, sorry, that should, the labels are flipped here, but anyway, that's kind of measuring vertical DI, and then horizontal DI is different policy proposals on policy areas. Note, we kind of average them up across policy areas in this particular paper. If the comments arise, we could also look a little bit more into depth. There's also a lot in this paper, but we could also go by differences in policy areas. So a first thing that we wanted to show you is this is across those different Eurobarometers, and in 2013 we lack the data, but in other times we do have it, where we have these general questions about, you know, two-speed EU support, so a form of differentiated integration. And interestingly, we see a slight increase over time for support for DI, but also we plotted in the kind of green line or blue line, if you can see it, the percentage of people who say that they don't know. And it's interesting that people actually are becoming more positive, but the don't know decrease. So actually people have a more crystallized opinion when it comes to differentiated integration, when it comes to two-speed Europe. So then looking at more horizontal integration, differentiated integration, which we rely on data from the Eurobarometer of 2008 to 2018, we do see clearly regional patterns, right? So where traditionally it was a little bit all over the place in 2008, we see after the two crises, the financial crisis, or the three nowadays, the refugee crisis and the COVID crisis, we see that there is a lot of evidence, a lot of support for differentiated integration in richer Northern European member states. Thomas Vincent and Benjamin Leratz have also outlined this when we looked at member states. So there's definitely differentiation across member states. What we do in our following analysis is take that differentiation out by introducing country fixed effects. We're really interested now to see if there's also variation across individuals when it comes to their preferences towards DI. And this is just an overview of the YouGov survey that was done in 2020, where we have things like preferences for two speeds, preferences for opt-outs. And here we look across countries. So we know there's variations in the levels. You see that here, right? Variations across member states. But we now differentiate it out by pro versus more Eurosceptic citizens. And what you see is that the patterns between more pro and Eurosceptic are the same, right? So preferences towards two speeds Europe, that's more supported by pro-EU citizens than by Eurosceptic citizens, while the reverse is true for opt-outs, right? So more Eurosceptic citizens are more positive about opt-outs than more pro-EU citizens. So this shows that even if we have level differences, what we have focused on a lot between member states, there's interesting variation within countries where pro-EU citizens hold very different preferences than Eurosceptics, but this difference is always in the same direction, if you will, right, across member states. So then when we think about, you know, there's many more analysis that we do in the paper, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things. When we look at the drivers of differentiated integration, when we now split a sample of more pro-EU versus neutral citizens that we put here together versus more Eurosceptic citizens, and we look at the drivers like ideology, gender, age, education, unemployment, and your trouble of paying bills, what we see very interestingly, so on the left-hand side is horizontal DI, on the right-hand side is vertical DI. We see a lot of the time that these coefficients are pretty similar across pro and more Eurosceptic, so that even it might be a difference in significance, but they're kind of on the same direction. But we see some interesting things going on for left-right placement, for ideology. Note that this is also not a dummy, right? So this is a scale from 1 to 10, 1 being more left-wing, 10 being more right-wing. So actually these effects are quite large, even if they look different, smaller here as coefficients, but the other factors like gender are of course from 0 to 1, right? So you have a different effect in the size. And what we actually find is that while more right-wing pro-EU citizens actually are really opposed to vertical DI, more right-wing Eurosceptic citizens become more positive about DI. And we see it also similarly a little bit at the horizontal, but less clear than for vertical. And I will go to plot this a little bit more. So here what we plot now is, I mentioned, right? So it's a scale on ideology. We plot here from very left-wing citizens to very right-wing citizens, self-identification. And here we have the differences in predicted DI preferences, horizontal and vertical DI, respectively, among Eurosceptic and more pro-EU. And what interestingly, first, you see that the slope for the light blue line is more sharp. So that means that there's more difference based on ideology among Eurosceptic citizens than there is among pro-EU citizens, and that's also statistically significant. So ideology does more for Eurosceptic citizens. And then interestingly, when it comes to horizontal DI and vertical DI, it's the reversed effect, right? So we find actually that more left-wing Eurosceptic people are more skeptical about vertical DI, but more right-wing Eurosceptic people are more positive about vertical DI, whereas the opposite is true for horizontal DI. And the interesting thing is what you already see a little bit from this, from the differences between kind of pro and Eurosceptic citizens, is that while pro-EU citizens here are much more positive about horizontal DI, Eurosceptics are much more negative, and the reverse is the case for vertical, right? So this gives you a little bit of an indication that horizontal DI, which can of course be that certain policy areas we go further, is, you know, we in the EU would think about as like enhanced cooperation, for example. That is something that's quite positively evaluated, even though we don't have the direct survey question, but from this you could infer that is quite positively viewed among more pro-EU citizens, while more Eurosceptic citizens actually want opt-outs and two-speeds Europes, more differentiation. So it's interesting that DI really serves a different purpose, if you will, for more pro-EU citizens vis-a-vis more Eurosceptic citizens. So this gives you also a first indication that it might not be dealing with this politicization in the way that we often think, right? So then when we turn to the party level results, I did now two things. So in vertical DI, that's the only thing we have from the Chapel Hill expert survey, that we can only construct a vertical DI a question from that survey. And here we look at pro-EU parties and Eurosceptic parties that are then based also on the Chapel Hill expert classification. And what we do in order to make that comparable on the public opinion side, we ask people which party that you vote for, or which party do you feel close to, and is that a Eurosceptic or more pro-EU party? And on the vertical DI, you see exactly an opposite pattern when it comes to the effective ideology, right? So of kind of pro-EU parties measured through the Chapel expert survey. So that's what you see here on the right. We see virtually no change based on ideology, and we see again that for Eurosceptic parties it matters. But it's exactly the reverse effect that we find in the public, right? In the public, we find that more right-wing Eurosceptics are more pro-EU, pro-vertical differentiation, and we find exactly the opposite on the party side. So where we have both public opinion and party level data, we also don't find that the party results match those of the public. Okay, and now to conclude, in order to stay in time, so in general, the EU public has become more supportive of differentiated integration, and also their opinions have become more crystallized. We find less people, you know, displaying don't knows, but we find differences between vertical and horizontal DI support. So horizontal DI is very popular among more pro-EU segments of the population, and vertical DI is more popular among Eurosceptics. Then ideology also plays a role, where we find if you're pro-EU and left-wing, you show more support for horizontal DI. If you're more Eurosceptic and right-wing, you support more vertical DI. So this gives you already an indication is that when the EU, when differentiated integration is in order to like kind of deal with differences by getting one member state to go further than another, that's supported by Eurosceptics, where it's about, you know, taking one policy area all virtually further, so enhanced cooperation, that's a kind of a more pro-EU support in the public, right? And these patterns that we find on the public are really not found at this moment in time when we compare it with the 2019 Chapel expert survey at the party level. And also in the paper, we look at differences between government and opposition as well. We really find a discrepancy where on vertical DI preferences between those of parties and those of voters, which is also kind of interesting in how we think that those DI preferences are then taken into the political debate or taken into negotiations. So that was the presentation from my side. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments.
You have to unmute, Jonathan.
Yes, I'm doing it. Sorry, thank you. Thanks so much, Catherine, for the very clear presentation and sticking to time. an interesting thing that really comes out is, in a way, how closely correlated attitudes towards differentiated integration are, both with standard measures of Euroscepticism and left-right ideology. And of course, that raises some questions about how far differentiated integration can help to solve impasses which are generated by the intersection of those classic positions. So now let me turn it over to Dirk.
Okay, I'll try to give you access to my screen. Can you see my screen now? Sorry, can you see my screen?
Not yet, no.
Not yet, surprising. Okay, we'll give it another try. Okay, so now, does it work now?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll go into the full presenting mode. So those of you who haven't been present in the pre-talk to this talk, excuse the green, it's just a camera error in my computer, so don't mind the green, and I hope the slides are nicely visible. So I'm presenting work we conducted together with Julian Schüssler and Jana Gomez-Diaz. So this is a paper that was recently even accepted for publication, and it is very closely aligned to what Catherine just presented. So these papers, well, they somehow complement each other, I would think. We're taking a little bit of a different turn, but we're interested basically in very similar issues. And I think that's a very fine coincidence that we're on the same panel. And I should also say that we are both trying to improve on what we have already established and found in common future work. So the starting point here is that differentiated integration has become a reality in the European Union. It is a concept that was severely contested back in the 1970s. In the 1980s, we saw some first steps towards differentiated integration. If you think of the Schengen regime, which was concluded outside the treaty framework. And we can see nowadays that in almost half of all integrated policy areas, there's, in terms of the primary law, some degree of differentiation, which either means that outside states opt into certain EU regimes, such as Norway for the European Economic Area, or in the Eurozone, where you see that inside states, so certain member states of the European Union, do not join these regimes. In secondary law, as Frank Schimmelpfennig and Katharina Holzing and colleagues have established, DI has become a reality as well. So it's a fact, it exists. But what we're discussing nowadays is, of course, the future of Europe. And in the Commission's white paper on the future of Europe, issued in 2017, there were various scenarios that were actually addressing more or less directly the issue of differentiated integration. And we know a lot about the state level causes. So Frank Schimmelpfennig has been talking about this morning. And I think there's a basic concept that heterogeneity is the driving force. However, when differentiated integration is something that paves the way for future integration, or is one of the roads that the European Union may take in the future, it will be important to assess whether this concept and the basic ideas of differentiated integration are applauded by the EU citizens. And surprisingly, we still know very, very little about the extent of support and the correlates in terms of the variables that explain support at the individual level of citizens. And that's what we're trying to do with this paper. The starting point here is that amongst citizens, the knowledge of DI is limited. When you look at people on the streets or sit in the swimming pool over summer, as I did in a public swimming pool, and you don't think that you want to ask people, what do you think about differentiated integration? They couldn't care less, and that would at least be my opinion, at least the majority of people. And if they don't really care about these technicalities that have been first assessed by lawyers or legal scholars and political scientists have sort of jumped on the concept, but the usual citizen, he or she is not really interested in this issue as well. So that makes it somehow difficult to assess how he or she feels about the issue. Now, when we look back at other explanatory approaches to EU public opinion, we could resort to cue taking. So Catherine has been very active in this field, but how do you get cues? I mean, you've been presenting some data on parties, but let's face it, is it really something where you say, well, my favorite party, what does it think about differentiated integration? And I follow. No, I don't think this is what's really happening in the minds of a lot of citizens. So I think that's very unclear. The link to EU support. Now, this is an interesting issue. And I think Catherine, in her presentation, you or she has made some very important comments and findings, but the story is really not clear. A pro-European citizen could evaluate the issue very differently as compared to an anti-EU citizen. And that again depends on the causal ideas that differentiated integration might entail. So for the pro-European, centrifugal forces would be very dangerous because it would drive apart the European Union. A Eurosceptic would say that's a great thing, so let's get started with differentiated integration. If you, on the other hand, assume that differentiated integration has some centripetal forces, then the European pro-European could applaud and say this is a good thing, and the Eurosceptic would be more skeptical. So we're not clear where this would actually lead. Our hunch in the paper is that we should actually start with other dispositions that citizens may have. And our claim is that we are sort of have as a test balloon for the argument is that we say citizens take differentiation seriously and by the word. So they think in terms of differentiation versus equality and solidarity. So for them, a societal differentiation will be equated to something that might destroy an equality between European Union member states. And that will be something that could actually inform their evaluations of the concepts. On the other hand, they could also have some utility-related thoughts about that issue. And here they would move from the individual level and their individual dispositions on whether equality is a value of that is very important for societies, or differentiation would sort of allow for progress in an economic sense that would sort of boost competition, etc. They could move to the country level, and they could think that there might be forms of differentiation that are discriminatory, and if they are the ones that fear to be discriminated against, they should oppose differentiated integration. If they think it's something to grant exemptions, and they think their country may be in the position to profit from exemptions, then they could be in support of differentiated integration. So two levels should matter, A, the individual level, and B, the state level. So let me quickly highlight some of our hypotheses. So the hypothesis one is at the individual level, and the basic idea is that differentiated integration per se is a liberal idea. And if you look at the picture here on the screen, you see Ralf Dahrendorf discussing with Rudi Dutschke, the student leader. The debate took place in 1968, so it has nothing to do whatsoever with differentiated integration. But one of the first persons talking in favor of differentiated integration is actually Ralf Dahrendorf. And he is the paradigmatic liberal here that I put on the screen. Rudi Dutschke, the student leader, would certainly value equality stronger. And my hunch would be that he would be opposed to differentiated integration. Our hypothesis read as following: higher education leads to more support of DI. Occupation, white-collar workers and self-employed should support differentiated integration. If you suffer from financial problems, you could be against the differentiated integration because you fear a lack of solidarity in principle. If you support equality, then you should be opposed to DI. If you support free trade, so the economic liberal, he or she should be pro-DI, and that should also translate to the center-right placement on differentiated integration, where our story would be that center-right people should be in favor of DI. So that's very interesting when we see your results, Catherine, that at least partly do not corroborate that, at least when you play the interaction with Euroscepticism. So at the second level, we can move to the country level. Here again, this discrimination versus exemptive story that I alluded to before comes into play. And we could also say that this matters. In addition, one could expect that countries that are very pro-integration might also be in favor of differentiated integration in order to promote some progress in a heterogeneous EU 27 with growing numbers of gridlocks. If you translate the citizen to the state level and this into the macro-regional level, we would expect more support for differentiated integration in the north as compared to the east and the south. Finally, we could interact that so that dire economic circumstances could make liberal dispositions less relevant. So equality could become more important, and possibly general EU support in the South could be negatively correlated with differentiated integration, which might be conceived to undermine the European project or the spirit of the treaties. We look at Eurobarometer data, so we just focus on one item that is offered by the Eurobarometer, and it reads on following with regards to the idea of a two-speed Europe. So note the issue is a two-speed Europe. It's not DI in general, it's the two-speed concept. Which of the following comes closest to your personal preference? Those ready to intensify the development of a common European policy in a certain important areas should do so without having to wait for the others, or they should wait until all member states of the EU are ready. And the wording is important. So what does ready mean? Are you willing or are you capable to do that? That's in the English language not quite clear. An issue that is a little bit tricky here, which you should be keeping in mind. We think this item is nevertheless still valid to be used because it gives us an intuitive understanding of the concept of differentiated integration without getting into too many details. So we run linear multi-level models, and I'll present some results. So those are descriptives. They should already be quite familiar to you if you listen to Catherine's talk and are a quick calculator. So this is aggregate data. On the left-hand panel, you see support for differentiated integration and support for membership in the EU, which is the dotted line, the membership. And we see this from 2011 to 2017. We note when we look at the black line is that there's been a prominent drop in support of differentiated integration in consequence of the Eurozone crisis, perhaps, so kicking in about 2014, 2015, and then we see a resurgence of support for differentiated integration. And we can see that today there's more than a majority of EU citizens in support of differentiated integration. Now, if we disaggregate that data and look to the right-hand panel, we can see that there are noteworthy differences between the macro regions, North, South, and East. The North clearly supports differentiated integration to a large extent. In contrast, the South is very skeptical, and it seems to recover a bit. So in the right-hand side, you see that the support is again going up, and I'll show you in a while. I'll show you a next picture, which will actually tell you something about before the Eurozone crisis. So important to note, there are substantive differences. Now, this is also shown on this sort of table, the many plots. We don't want to get in detail, but what this plot actually shows you very quick visual inspection. Well, there's a lot of heterogeneity. There's a lot of heterogeneity. You see countries such as Spain up here, which clearly is in opposition. You see the Netherlands. Where are the Netherlands here? Very strong supporters, let's say, of differentiated integration, and the patterns are hard to reconcile, something that strikes me as being important. When we move from the descriptives to inferential statistics, we can now see marginal effects. So for different variables, and here we concentrate in this graph on the socio-demographic variables and the region indicators, and this is also corroborated if you look down at the left-hand panel, you can clearly see that Southern Europe is far more opposed to differentiated integration as compared to Northern Europe. The students up right here, the upper right panel highlights that I was right with my Rudi Dutschke example. So students don't seem to like differentiated integration. However, if they are well educated, so if they close their studies, then they sort of become more in favor of that, but the effects are not that big. Now here's the free markets versus social equality. And here we can see on this plot that indeed people valuing social equality to a stronger degree oppose differentiated integration. So at the individual level, if you're supporting equality, if you think inequality is a big problem, then in general, or there's a certain effect where we can see this seems to make this disposition seems to have an effect on your evaluation of differentiated integration. So we can find that there's very weak and zero correlations with class and financial problems. Education is positive, equality lowers the support, free trade increases support for differentiated integration, and on the political right, we do find overall more support for differentiated integration in the panels or in the data that we've been taking a look at. The general EU support, in contrast to our expectation, is actually in strong correlation, positive with differentiated integration. This is nothing that we had expected, but which is shown by the data. And the South, as we expected, is actually a little bit the odd person out. Now, this is interesting when we look at this final picture here. Yes, 2 minutes. Sorry, Jonathan. So what you see here is that the support in the South, actually before the Eurozone crisis happened, was very strong. So we see a reverse picture when looking at so in the middle we don't have data for that period. So we do see a trend that is changing here. So to conclude, DEI is a far-reaching legal and political reality. There's still a limited knowledge on individual support, and we try to repair that with the paper and with future research that we're doing together with Catherine and Lisanne to actually get a better idea of what people know about differentiated integration and how they evaluate it, also in anticipation of how they might be affected by that policy. We see some noteworthy differences, South versus Northeast. Possibly citizens in the South consider DI as something like a social stratification, which is a hindrance to their development, and they might fear being excluded, and liberal values play a role at the individual level. So I'll leave it with that, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dirk. Very interesting findings. I'm intrigued by the differences in interpretation with Catherine, as well as the similarities on some dimensions. What strikes me immediately is that what seems crucial is not just for individuals, but also for countries, is how they expect to be affected by the differentiated integration in question. And countries that expect or interpret the issue that they might group of countries going ahead together, they tend to be opposed. Otherwise, it would be hard to see why, for instance, there's so much support in the Netherlands for DI. We don't really see the Dutch electorate bursting to move ahead with closer cooperation, perhaps outside the field of defense, certainly not, let's say, for completing banking union and so on. Okay, so let's move to our third presentation, where we shift from public opinion in general to governments and political discourses. And so, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Yes, let me share my screen. All right. Thank you everyone for being here today and for this opportunity to present some of our results of our research on the question of what member state governments have to say about differentiated integration. This research was conducted in the IndiviU project at the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies in Florence under the leadership of Professor Bridget Lafan and with my support. We focused on two main questions. The first question is, how important is differentiated integration to member state governments? Do they talk about it at all? Do they take it seriously? The second question was, what positions do member state governments have on differentiated integration? And to give you a quick overview of what we did in the last 9 months, we assembled a team of 27 contributors who were asked to produce a report for each of the 27 member states, answering our two main research questions. Many thanks to all the contributors again. They did this based on an analysis of governmental documents, and I will talk about which documents we looked at in a bit. And we are covering the time period between 2004 and 2019. Now, in today's presentation, I will have to focus on the first question: how important is differentiated integration to member state governments, for the simple fact that we do not yet have a systematic overview of all member states' positions on the issue, because we got the reports over the summer and we first focused on the salience question. I'm sorry for that, but today's presentation is going to be on salience. So now, how did we go about studying the salience of DI in governmental discourses? What we did is to distinguish 3 levels of discourse. At the most abstract level, we looked at different models of differentiated integration. And here in particular, we looked at the difference between a multi-speed model and a multi-end model of the European Union. The way we looked at these was by focusing on specific keywords or concepts that are associated with these different models, which you can see here. And we collected data for each of these keywords and each member state and each year, which would allow us to reassemble these keywords into different models. For example, you could have 3 different models looking at time, space, and matter, which I think is an important point, but I will not go further into this. The second level we looked at is mechanisms of differentiated integration, and here we looked at enhanced cooperation, which allows some member states to do more than others. And on the other hand, we looked at opt-outs, allowing a member state to do less than other member states. And finally, we looked at 21 instances of differentiated policies or policy fields in which differentiation actually exists or is being debated. And here we have instances of enhanced cooperation, instances of opt-out policy fields, as well as examples of inter se agreements, which are agreements between member states, but outside the European Union framework, such as the Fiscal Compact. And we also look at external agreements between the European Union and non-member states, such as the EEA. So to measure salience of DI models, mechanisms, and instances, what we did was to simply count keywords in key documents. And the rationale behind it is that the more a concept or keyword is being talked about, the more importance is given to it. And what also matters is where governments talk about issues. So we try to focus on documents that give us kind of a little bit of a variety of where governments may talk about different things that they assess as being important. So we looked first of all at government programs and coalition agreements. Then we looked at various speeches by and statements by prime ministers to look at different venues and different key moments. And finally, we cast our web more broadly to also included parliamentary debates, here focusing on what ministers and prime ministers had to say, but also including what members of governing and opposition parties said. And this was quite fruitful, and I will come back to this. The advantages of our approach are, we believe that it gives an objective measure to salience, and especially there's granularity to our results. So as I already mentioned, we have data for each of the keywords in each member state and each year between 2004 and 2019. And what it also allows us to do is to compare both within a member state over time as well as between member states. However, there are also some disadvantages to our approach, and obviously our list of keywords may miss some debates on differentiated integration just because governments' documents don't use the keywords that we were focusing on. To address this issue, we asked our contributors to also engage in a close reading of the documents. And what we found here is that we do miss some references, but that it does not really affect our results significantly. Another disadvantage may be language and translation. Not all keywords easily translate into all the languages we had to cover. And I think what we learned in doing this is that not all member states, in fact, have a very developed vocabulary to debate differentiated integration. We tried to make this transparent by including tables of the English keywords as well as their local translations and comments in each of the reports. Now I want to highlight 3 of our first main findings. Salience is really pretty low in most member states for most of the time under investigation. And this particularly applies to models of differentiated integration, which means that governments rarely really talk about differentiated integration at the conceptual level, while they talk about it a little more when it comes to the mechanisms of differentiation. And then when it comes to instances of differentiated integration, so differentiated policies, these can be highly salient in different member states, and salience can really just explode very suddenly here. Secondly, we found very few references to either of these 3 levels in government programs and speeches, which underlines the low salience, I would say. And we found parliamentary debates to be a more fruitful source of data. The second main finding is that we did not see a strong trend of the salience increasing or decreasing. Instead, we saw peaks around certain key events. And these were, in particular, treaty changes, but also the Euro crisis. And then, as you will see shortly, the 2017 debate on the future of Europe was a very strong peak. And lastly, we see a lot of variation across member states, which makes sense given our theoretical expectations. But I want to highlight that the variation may be inflated by our methodology due to language issues, and I will come back to that. Now I will use the remaining time I have to illustrate these findings with some examples based on parliamentary debates. So what you can see on this slide is the salience of the debate on the models of differentiated integration for almost all member states between 2004 and 2019. What you can see first of all is it is a very low salience issue in most member states for most of the time. And second of all, excuse me, the orders of magnitude in the debates are quite comparable, and rarely does a debate go above 40 mentions of conceptual keywords in any one year. But there are some peaks. For example, if you look at 2008 in Ireland, we see a strong peak, which is related to the negative referendum in Ireland, which triggered a quite intense debate on differentiation related to the potential emergence of a 2-tier Europe. And a debate with around 80 hits in that year is actually quite intense. Then you see that more member states start participating in the debate in the time around 2010 to 2013, around the height of the Euro crisis. And finally, the greatest increase you see in 2017. And interestingly, it goes up and then it goes down again very quickly. So there's no sustained debate here. You see this even more clearly if you aggregate the keywords by year. 2017 really stuck out overall. Now, if we look at the variation between member states, we do see some variation, but overall, for all member states, quite low salience. If you look at some of the member states, you may wonder if the results make sense. And I want to go into 3 examples here. If you direct your attention to the right side and you look at Slovakia, you may wonder, it seems to be differentiated integration may have been like a little bit too intense here. And if you look into the data, we see that this debate has been almost exclusively on the issue of core Europe, which is in fact quite characteristic of the new member states we find. The focus on a distinction between a core and a periphery, where the new member states view themselves as being in the periphery and aspiring to joining the core. Then another example, if you look at the left-hand side at Croatia, very low frequencies of conceptual keywords, which does in a way make sense because Croatia joined the European Union only in 2013, was the last member state to join. But at the same time, what we see, if we look into our data, is that we only find references to the idea of a multi-speed Europe, but none of the other keywords, which we would interpret as the vocabulary of DI not being easily translatable into Croatian, or rather that in Croatia, the vocabulary to talk about differentiated integration is just not very developed and complex. And finally, I want to mention Ireland in the center of this slide. Very high salience of differentiation, it seems, which makes sense considering Ireland's history of having opt-outs and its close association with the UK. But again, it may be a little bit inflated here for the simple reason that we used an English vocabulary. Ireland is the only country where we could use our original English keywords. And it seems that both in academic debate and political debate, the concepts are most developed in the English language. And now I want to zoom into Ireland a little bit. If we look at the development of the salience of differentiated integration in Ireland since 1990, you see, you can tell a story that makes sense, I believe. If you look at the early 90s, you see increased salience around the Maastricht Treaty, as well as the 1995 enlargement. Then again, the Nice Treaty, the Eastern Enlargement, the Lisbon Treaty, and the Future of Europe debate. On the other hand, I also want to point out things where we may have expected higher frequencies of conceptual keywords, but didn't find them, which is in the example of the Amsterdam Treaty, the failed EU constitution, the Euro crisis, and astonishingly, Brexit, which did not trigger a conceptual debate, at least not in 2016. Some of that is in 2017. So, and we go into these findings in the reports, but I cannot go into details now. On the next slide, on this slide, you see what happens if we distinguish between the 2 models we looked at, multi-speed Europe and multi-end Europe, again for Ireland. And here we have to interpret our findings or the results with some caution. What I can say is our hunch is that politicians do not really use the keywords in a very distinct way, but the distinctions are often blurred and keywords are used interchangeably, not always consistently being applied to different models of differentiated integration. Then in the remaining 30 seconds, I want to say a few words about mechanisms and instances. If we look at enhanced cooperation, we see a similar pattern to what we find for models of differentiated integration. First of all, the Irish referendum triggered a debate, and then a much stronger debate took place in the Netherlands. And the reason for this is that, I'm sorry, there was the idea and the fear in Ireland that, I'm sorry, my time is up. That The negative referendum result in Ireland may result in other member states using enhanced cooperation to move ahead. And there was a huge debate about that in the Netherlands. We see increased salience in the Euro crisis again and again in the years 16, 17, 18 around Brexit, PESCO, the public prosecutor, and the future of Europe debate. Briefly on opt-outs, very interesting, 2 countries stick out. They are Ireland and Denmark, which does make sense intuitively, again around 2008-9, time of treaty change. And again in 2015, the same 2 countries around the Danish referendum on Danish opt-out referendum and the Irish debate on the prospective British membership referendum. Then very, very quickly in 1 minute, some examples or instances of differentiation. PESCO, for example, you see there was virtually no debate until 2017, when there was quite an intense debate, especially in Ireland. You see similar patterns for the fiscal compact, for example, clearly triggered by the Euro crisis, and in the Czech Republic a few years later when they joined the fiscal compact. Also similar, the financial transaction tax, again, a clear peak in 2012 and then somehow tapering off. And as a final example, the European Public Prosecutor with an increasing debate over the years, especially in the Central and Eastern European member states. To sum up, our results so far show DI is a low salience issue in most member states for most of the time. There's no strong trend, but there are peaks around key European events mainly. There's a lot of variation across member states. Some of that may be due to the methodology we used. And next steps for us would be to systematically assess government positions. We have already hired someone for doing this next to myself. So we're doing this now, but we don't have it yet. And finally, all the reports as well as all the data sets will be made available in our IndieView database. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks so much, Stefan. Very interesting preliminary results. The combination with of low salience, so the whole thing is not at least politically extremely salient, but quite a lot of variation, not only across member states, but also around the different types of differentiated integration. So there, the question is whether we're dealing with a single phenomenon or whether people react very differently, let's say, to opt-outs and closer cooperation. So I think there are some points of intersection with the other 2 papers. So let me again encourage people to put questions in the Q&A. Someone also put a question in the chat. I've picked that up. I'll use that, but it's easier if they're all in the Q&A. And first, I want to give the panelists a chance to respond to each other. I've already made various comments. Feel free to respond to those. And I think the first thing I'd like to do is to give Brigitte Lafont, who hasn't spoken yet, a chance to come in if she would like to do so, and then I'll go through the presenters in the order they presented. So Brigitte.
Thank you. I think the first thing I would say is that in these papers, we really are seeing work on DI that we haven't seen before. Of course, it's new, but what I mean is that these are elements of DI that we haven't paid sufficient attention to, the attitude of individuals, but also member governments change over time. I'm also struck by the fact that we continue to have lots of different concepts for DI. We have vertical DI, horizontal DI, multi-speed DI, multi-end DI. And I think across all of our projects at some stage, maybe we need to revisit the conceptual discussion so that we are talking about the same things. Dirk drew out that there was a difference in terms of individual attitudes to DI and general support for the EU. And I think that's a very interesting issue to think about, because given that the EU is a system of DI, the DI is part of the policy and constitutional architecture of the EU, it strikes me that DI really is about what kind of EU, and that's really what we should focus on. What kind of EU, how contested. I'm very struck, as I knew the data that we had on the member governments, but also that from Stefan's paper, that DI is driven by EU developments, that it's driven by developments in integration that member states have to respond to. Either they have to respond to a treaty or a major policy event or whatever. So I would say those are two things: what kind of EU, and the way in which the domestic is both domestic as in individual citizens, but also governments, are brought into the DI space in terms of what kind of EU.
Thanks very much, Bridget. Yeah, it is kind of your point about conceptual convergence in the study of DI seems important, or at least to clarify where the differences are, because we saw this morning that the three kind of theoretical spokespersons for the three projects each were working with different conceptual categories and different conceptual foci. That seems a little bit less true here studying politics and preferences, but we don't have to agree, but we should agree on where we disagree. And secondly, your point about the correlation between peaks in discussion of different forms of DI and developments within European integration reminds me of Hans-Peter Kresi and his colleagues' studies of politicization, where again, at least until the recent poly crisis, we couldn't talk about a linear increase in politicization, but an ebb and flow of politicization, which also differed by country. So it might be worth thinking about that. Catherine, can I?
Yeah, thank you very much. So I've also thought about this. It's also some of the questions that came up, I think also is in terms of how the public really thinks about this, right? So clearly they're not thinking about horizontal and vertical DI. They have, totally agree with Dirk that they don't have really so many ideas about that. We see that also that people are more likely to give don't knows on these policy questions and less on these kind of two-speed questions, right? Which might be easier for them to understand. But I think the interesting thing is the point that Bridget raised is also in my own work on trying to get people to think about reform, which is very difficult because those are hypotheticals. But the idea that do people want to go deeper and do they want to go together, right? So, and I think that people have a sense of that. So I think, for example, I'm Dutch myself, and I see the Dutch discussion and the Italian discussion. So that the Dutch are very willing, like, well, we don't want to go deeper, but like we think that kind of people should, we all should kind of be on the same board and have the same obligations. Whereas the Italians are like, oh, if we lose a couple of people, but we go actually, we get more integration in certain areas that we want, that's preferable. So it's a very different conceptualization of what you want to do with the EU, right? So I think I'm definitely going to take up that position of Bridget and make that further. And I think also in that way, some of the results that we have square up with some of the results that Dirk has, because he also looks at slightly different things, right? So you look very much at, are we going to do it together? We also look very much at, do you want to go deeper, right? So I think that's really interesting to think about, that we should not only think about how we conceptualize it theoretically, but what we think people can grasp, right? So what are things that people can understand? And I think this deeper versus, deeper versus together, you can always think of a 2x2, right? Less member states, more member states, deeper or less deep or something like that, right? So anyway, I got very triggered by that, and I think that's a really interesting thing to think about.
Shall I take up? Jonathan,
sorry, Dirk, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, what I really like about Catherine's paper, to start with that one, is really this effect heterogeneity the interactions that you play around with, which I find very helpful. And obviously it's very nice to also see the linkage between the non-existing linkage between the allied or partisan data and the public data. And I think that should be, as citizens, that should make us a little bit concerned, or should wonder about the political communication of these issues, because there's an obvious allied public gap, which might, of course, also be due to what we've discussed earlier, this lacking salience. You find low salience for the allies, and my hunch would be that the salience is even lower for citizens, but that's something that we always need to keep in mind. Now, what we've been saying, or what you've been saying, is interesting, because this policy level issue is interesting. So far, you've been asking about different levels of horizontal differentiation and vertical differentiation. And I think if we take up what Bridget said earlier, that what kind of EU do the citizens want to live in, and what kind of idea of the EU does actually drive these citizens, my idea would be that this should also depend on the policy area. So our understanding of differentiated integration would possibly, at least from the average knowledgeable citizen, would depend whether he or she has been confronted with differentiated integration. So a non-member state of the Eurozone might think, oh, we're very happy not to have been in the Eurozone during the times of the crisis. So they would think, oh yeah, this has saved us a lot of money and a lot of concerns. Others might say, well, we would like to get into Schengen, and we are still not allowed in. We as Romanians, we are being discriminated against. And I think those are the things that we should be playing around with a little more also in the future research, because the smartest speed Europe is very general, but what do people really think when they hear the item? What policies do they actually think? I have one question, and I think I've understood it, but for the Stefan's paper, or Bridges and Stefan's paper, is this difference between enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. And I was wondering whether it actually, you frames it, or you look for an opt-out ex post or ex ante, because for me this boils down to the same thing. It's a little bit of a shift of a perspective on looking at the outsiders or those that want to move ahead. But basically, I would say enhanced cooperation allows some to go ahead and others stay back. But that's also what's happening in the primary law area in terms of the opt-outs that we see that have been negotiated post-Maastricht. Denmark allowed the others to move ahead. They didn't cast their veto, and allowed the others to further proceed with integration. So I wonder whether this is actually not just a different side of the coin, or whether it's seriously different ideas of differentiated integration. Yeah, that would be it.
Thank you. Stefan.
Yes, thank you very much. I do not have a lot to add to this. I just wanted to point out that I think the two papers presented by Dirk and Catherine will be very, very useful resources for our own project of once we start looking at what the member state governments actually want, what positions they take on differentiated integration. I think it will be very interesting to look at the connect between citizens and member state government positions, and see how closely they overlap. I'm looking forward to that. And then on Dirk's point on the distinction between enhanced cooperation and opt-outs, I want to first of all say that so far what we have done is to only count keywords and to measure salience. But in my personal understanding so far, there may be big differences in how member state governments think about what enhanced cooperation entails and what an opt-out entails. Again, if I use maybe Ireland as an example, Ireland has several opt-outs, so it is clearly using this mechanism, while at the same time it has been very critical of the mechanism of enhanced cooperation for fear that as a small member state it would lose leverage within the European Union And you can also see this in particular in certain issues that are especially salient in Ireland, for example, taxation. If you look at what the Irish debate is on the financial transaction tax, interestingly, where you have positive externalities for non-participants, then Ireland says, okay, you can go ahead. We will not stand in your way. We will also not participate, but a group of member states may move ahead. But on a principled level, Ireland has been quite critical of enhanced cooperation, whereas it has been has made use of opt-outs itself. Yes, thank you.
Okay, thanks to all of the panelists. We've got quite a few questions now, and I want to make sure that everybody has a chance to get their questions answered. And basically, I would say the questions fall into three categories. There are questions about the findings and the research methods used in the papers. And secondly, so those are two categories. And the third category is implications for the future and for political strategies for the EU. And I want to take the first two sets of questions first, and then have a kind of final round about what does this imply for what the EU, where is it going, and should it be going? So let me pull out a few questions which are basically methodological. So there's a question from Alexander Schillen, and it's for both Dirk and Catherine. I was wondering when listening to your results whether it wouldn't be more in line with the ongoing political debates to study public opinion on DI with a particular focus on specific issues like asylum or the Euro budget rather than the concept as a whole. And Stefan seems to do that for the member state governments. Could you perhaps reflect on possible approaches for studying public opinion on DI from a more issue-based perspective? Would you favor that? And are there already projects underway going in this direction? And there's another question which I interpret in a similar direction, which is from Stephen Wingate for Catherine. And he asks whether you differentiate between forms of DI. And in addition, I mean, I think there's some confusion about the concepts, because he asks, in addition to horizontal and vertical, does it look at multi-speed, opt-outs, etc.? Do those polled recognize this difference, or is it strictly horizontal and vertical DI? Since, if you like, multi-speed is more the vertical and opt-outs the horizontal. But we could ask, whether the multi-menu integration, that seems to be a missing dimension, although it was very salient in the discussion of condominio and differentiation this morning. For Stefan, there's a question from Magdalena Gora. Is your salience measure capturing if the statements are instances of support or contestation of DI? I mean, are you able to disaggregate pro and anti-DI statements, or is it a question of doesn't matter what you say about me as long as you spell my name right? Let me see some other ones. So Yazid asks Catherine, he'd like to know how was it possible to know the opinion of individuals concerning vertical DI? What types of questions were they asked, and how far were they aware of what that is all about anyway? To Dirk, he asks whether there's a correlation, in your opinion, between support of DI at the level of the wealth of the member state and individual support of DI. And to Stefan, Yazid asks, how do you explain why member states like Hungary and Poland did not show rise in support of DI at the vertical level at the height of the migration crisis after 2015. So I'll give each of you a chance to answer these specific questions posed to you, and then I'll take a final round of questions, which is about, let's say, the politics of DI and the future of European integration. So, Catherine, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, so I think it's very important to make clear, and I didn't have so much time in the presentation to do that, that of course we don't ask people, do you like horizontal or vertical DI, right? I mean, that's our own classification that we use, and maybe we should not do that. Maybe, you know, we take it from the literature, of course, and we want to link it to that. I mean, people are asked like about opt-outs, about two speeds, about their preferences to have more integration in certain policy areas, and if that should be done together or not, right? So from that, we construct, as researchers, this horizontal and vertical DI, right? So I think it would be interesting to, what we could do in the paper is to show that actually people's perceptions of if this should be applied jointly or in different policy areas, that we actually find, maybe contrary to what Alexander says, that actually people have more crystallized preferences, if the extent to which that should be jointly done or not, and less crystallized preferences actually in certain policy areas. And I think that, so kind of that's to maybe Yazid's and Stephen's question. So, you know, we look we make those classifications, and maybe we should, you know, we should just talk about it in terms of like, what is it on, with whom do you want it, and how much deeper do you want it? Maybe we should just, you know, discuss it like that rather than horizontal and vertical. Maybe that's clearer. And those are the questions that we use. I think that's just to Alexander's question about policy areas. So we are planning this, right, Dirk? We are doing this in kind of policy areas, but I think you have to be very careful with policy areas, that what we see in the don't know is that those policy areas are also really salient. So if those policy areas are not really salient, you see a lot of don't knows, and then that people actually use maybe their priors on that. But interestingly, what we expected to find is to find no differentiation on the policy areas, and actually we do find it. We find, you know, especially the Eurosceptics, they have very different preferences depending on a policy area. So it does show that people sometimes differentiate, and actually the pro-EU people are the ones that want uniform integration across policy areas, right? So it's kind of an area that we don't know. Dirk and I are also trying to look into that, but I think one is a bit constrained with, you know, if we ask people about very detailed policing or judicial reform, they have no idea what you're talking about, right? So it does need to be something that is salient enough so people have a tendency to have an opinion. But in some of those areas, you already have opt-outs, you already have, you know, like, so you are constrained by some of the reality in terms of what you can ask people. But I think it's very important to understand that there's different levels of don't knows, different levels of support across these different dimensions that we outline, but those dimensions are made up of several indicators per dimension. And I think that maybe we could be clearer in the paper how we did that. So it's a valid point.
Okay.
Yeah, I can follow up. I've actually answered Alexander's comment before seeing the question with my last intervention, and what Catherine said, I can fully subscribe to that. So yes, your point is very valid, Alexander, and we should take care in seeing how we could ideally implement this to get a better grasp at how this plays out at the level of individual policy areas, which would also allow us to get some interesting variance in terms of the distribution of countries in these different regimes. So I think that's a very valid and useful comment. To Yazid's question, yes, that's an excellent point. We've tested in the paper various country groups, whether this actually makes a difference, so whether Eurozone membership or non-Eurozone membership makes a difference, and it actually doesn't play out. The European Parliament once had a comment on differentiated integration. They postulated that they expected old member states to be more in favor of differentiated integration vis-a-vis the new ones, and that doesn't play out with the data, so we can't corroborate that. But your claim is actually quite correct. We've tested for net contributors, and we do find a positive effect. So we do find that net contributing states actually show about 10% higher support for differentiated integration as compared to the net recipients. We've preferred to, it's in the paper, but we prefer to sort of stick to the regional divide because it allows us to actually differentiate or distinguish the three groups, and basically the net contributors are the northern member states plus France and Italy. So it's in the paper, and I think the point is valid also when reflecting Frank Schimmelpfennig's presentation from this morning, where wealth of states also played a role. So I think this is a useful and valid comment. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Stefan, you have a couple of questions directed to you.
Yes, let me begin by trying to answer Magdalena's question about whether or not we also looked into what the positions of member states are on the different models, mechanisms, and instances that we studied. And my answer is yes, we did. But because of capacity limitations, so we only had one contributor for each member state, we couldn't code every single instance of when a reference to any one keyword was made. So we tried to focus on key years in which salience was very high, and then we focused on our two models, the multi-speed model and the multi-end model, as well as the two mechanisms, enhanced cooperation and opt-outs. And we tried to code in the peak years each of the references we found there as either negative, neutral, or positive, which is quite a simple coding scheme, I think, but that has mainly to do with resource limitations. But I cannot say more about that yet, because we are just starting now to look into this more systematically, which perhaps leads to Yazid's question on Hungary and Poland and why we don't see a change in position there in the migration crisis. And I just want to say that in this presentation, I have only focused on whether or not governments were talking about differentiation at this point in time. And it is possible that our keywords did not capture debates in Hungary and Poland, but I would have to look into this. I do not know yet whether Hungary and Poland have become more pro-DI after 2015. And finally, perhaps I could also briefly say something on the issue of focusing on positions on specific policy issues. Our first hunch at the moment when looking, when trying to understand the positions of member state governments is that we may have to distinguish between a preference on a particular issue on the one hand and a preference regarding the European Union as a system of international integration. While a government may have a strong preference for differentiation in one particular issue or against differentiation, that preference, it seems, is moderated by what the government expects over the long run to be the impact on the system overall. So, and again, maybe Ireland as an example. In Ireland, there is a lot of debate on whether repeated opt-outs and or enhanced cooperation, non-participation in enhanced cooperation will not limit Ireland's overall leverage in the European Union or enable other member states to proceed in integration without the opportunity for Ireland to block that by voting unanimously. So yeah, I think that last point, that it might be important to look at the difference between issue preferences and systemic preferences. It seems to be coming out of what we see for member state governments.
Okay, thanks. So now I have three final questions, which are really very much on policy and politics. And so one is from Neil Mortimer, actually a former student of mine, now doing a PhD. Welcome, Neil. So he asks, with a multi-speed EU, member states can opt in or out of communities as they please. Could this lead to a further breakup of the Union and divide public opinion as Eastern member states become second class? That's the assumption of who will be most affected. Then there is a question from Hakan Uzlu. He says, what if differentiated never happens? Could the EU stay integrated after Brexit or the COVID-19 crisis? What happens if a new crisis occurs before the EU would be able to show solidarity after these two crises? And finally, from Konstantin Schaefer, having in mind the results of Catherine's analysis, namely different preferences regarding vertical horizontal DI between Eurosceptics and Europhiles, I wonder whether there are potential institutional reforms that would tackle both kinds of preferences. In other words, what future EU pathway or reforms could address the concerns and wishes of both groups, Eurosceptics and Europhiles? And that indeed seems to be a critical question coming out of the findings of this wave of research. So Catherine, I'll give you a chance to answer briefly first, and then we'll take Dirk and Stefan, and then we can wind up.
Yeah, so maybe I can relate specifically to Konstantin's question and also with that. So I've done in other work, I've done explicitly is giving people reform proposals. That was in my book on Euroscepticism. And the interesting thing is what we haven't talked about yet now here is that where in my work on that, so it's conjoints and people have to kind of compare different EUs and reforms that they want, that actually where you see Eurosceptics and Europhiles, if we call them that, really differentiate is how you legitimize, so who takes decisions. So Eurosceptics really want an intergovernmental Europe, right? So they want national, they want national referenda, they want national governments, they don't want a lot of, that also kind of links up with what I find here, right? That there will also be in kind of two speeds where they probably think that their government is more in control or where they have regained some sovereignty away from EU institutions. And, and then if you think about how you would square that with Europhiles in the same country, that's very tricky, right? If the Europhiles were really so regionally organized, so it was really about, oh, well, we have to deal with kind of the UK being a Eurosceptic population and we have to deal with that, and then we can granted a couple of opt-outs, that will be fine. But what we find really is differences within countries about how they think, for example, climate change should be tackled. Eurosceptics think, well, it should be gone over more, differentiated forms of vertical integration, where actually pro-EU people within the same country think, well, we should actually integrate more on that. So the problem, I think, is that what you see is that the way that what kind of EU you want is really seriously politicized within member states. So then what you grant member states at the national level, well, that's not going to accept or please either of them. So it's kind of, in order maybe to deal with some of these concerns, you would have to basically allow, you would have actually, that needs to be settled in domestic politics way more than actually you can do much on that. But then, domestic politicians are really very happy to forward all of these problems, to the EU level. So I see this as a fundamental issue. And Konstantin, if you have a good idea about how that should be solved institutionally, I'm more open to it. But I think actually some form of EU reform won't really cut it, because you might do it on a policy area, but then people don't like how that policy area is being decided on, and who is that the Commission is, for example, doing more than a national government, right? So I think a lot of disappointment or dissatisfaction will last, and that you really have to settle this debate domestically, and how we will do that, I don't know.
Thank you, Catherine. Dirk.
Okay, well, I think this is a very smart comment by Konstantin Schäfer, but the answer is obviously hard to give because it's a smart question. So my hunch would be that it's about what kind of horizontal DI is allowed in what kind of policy areas. And what I mean by that is that we would probably need to take a look at the externality structure in that specific policy area. When there's a strong negative externality and the differentiated integration is linked to an incapacity of joining, that will certainly be something that might be considered as unfair by many EU citizens. If it's a policy that doesn't have great negative external effect for the others, so there's no big costs involved, why not integrate it further by those that want to move ahead towards what you may want to call an ever closer union. So I think that would be one general idea, but that's obviously the tricky issue. Now, Neil's question, the multi-speed and whether there's a danger of breaking up in a second-class Europe. Yeah, that's the key problem here. Does DI contribute to these, what I called earlier, picking up on Alcuin Köhliker's work, the centrifugal effects? So does it drive apart the European member states? Would it be worthwhile to possibly agree on something that is not as far-reaching, but more inclusive to them together, develop a policy further, or is the European Union condemned to stagnation and an incapacity to act? And that's obviously the challenge. The second class aspect is certainly something that we should take into consideration. If you think of the paper that I presented today, certainly there's something about a concern of, or that will be my interpretation of the data, that many citizens in Southern Europe, less so in Eastern Europe, fear to be left out and be treated as second-class European citizens. And that's certainly something that has been triggered or intensified during the Eurozone crisis. Now, with the Eastern Europeans, they do tend to understand, at least that's my interpretation, that DI can also serve them. If they can get out of the relocation scheme of refugees, they're very pro-DI. Yeah, and that's something that the Eastern Europeans seem to have realized. They seem to have interestingly less concerns about being left out and being second-class Europeans. Now, Hakan's question, whether it never happens and how this is linked to crisis, well, DI is there. So it's something that's on the stage, and there's many examples for DI in existence. Now, you refer to Brexit, and that's interesting because my impression, at least, was that Brexit reduced to some extent the demand for DI. So we saw quite some strong unity amongst European Union member states, and apparently it was realized that there's also a certain danger of granting too strong concessions to some member states. And the data that Catherine presented earlier, I was very struck by seeing that British pro-European citizens, yes, there are British pro-European citizens, they tend to that the I is bad. So that struck me as being something interesting, and that might go into this direction that you've been hinting at, Hakan. The COVID crisis, I think, is really illustrating that we need to reconcile what I would call procedural and distributive justice. So this is really this inner linkages of what we tend to when we try to evaluate institutions behind the veil of ignorance, but in reality, these institutions have a great distributive consequences for citizens, and I think citizens care more about the latter. And in redesigning the European Union, these two dimensions need to be taken on board to set up models that are workable for the future. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Dirk. I mean, another thing to keep in mind is also the problem-solving capacity of the EU in different areas. And one of the things we're doing a lot of conjoint survey experiments here at the University of Amsterdam on issues like unemployment reinsurance, like fiscal and public health solidarity, but also on reform of the system for regulating and authorizing pesticides. And one of the things that we find there is that very often views about whether the reforms will deliver effective results outweighs the more Europe, less Europe, what level should decisions be taken. That's something to keep in mind. Stefan, would you like the last word?
Well, yes, thank you. Maybe very, very briefly on the question of whether fragmentation. Just what I thought was an interesting observation is that member state governments actually seem to be more critical of the idea of a multi-speed Europe than they are of the idea of a multi-end Europe. I'm not 100% sure about that yet, but it seems to be the case. What I think to Europe, there will be more migration, and if not in the core Euro sector, so that seems to be implied in the idea of two different speeds, while as in a multi-end Europe, the idea of sovereignty seems to be much more central, that the member state can decide to opt out. And therefore it seems that in certain situations, multi-end Europe is actually seen more positive than multi-speed Europe. And maybe very briefly on the question on what reforms would be necessary to make everybody happy. But here just my very personal hunch is that differentiated integration, I think, would be much more acceptable to wider parts of the population if it would be connected to democratization of the European Union. If you would say that some countries may move ahead, there may be a core, but at the same time, that core should strive to become more democratic and less technocratic. That's just my personal opinion. Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. Let me thank all of the panelists for their very stimulating contributions. Let me also thank you, the audience, for your engagement and your questions. I mean, one of of course, we would also like to meet face-to-face again one day, but one of the nice things about these online events is that we can bring together colleagues, students, friends from all over Europe and North America, and I see some of you in the list of participants. Let me also say, I should have said this at the beginning, just to apologize for my colleague Teresa Kuhn, who was supposed to moderate and had a sick child at home, so I stepped in, but I'm sure she would have very much liked to be with us, and we hope to see many of you. We still have 4 more panels, one on Brexit this evening, one which tomorrow morning, which is more looking at different forms of governance in different policy fields and how that fits with differentiation. One on the normative dimension. Is DI a good thing or a bad thing? Also for democracy and justice, we'll have in the afternoon, and finally a concluding panel on DI and the future of European integration. So I hope to see lots of you at all or some of these panels. Have a good afternoon.